Oh, God.
These were the words spoken in a South Carolina courtroom as the jury delivered their verdict. A crime so monstrous, so unspeakable, that even the most hardened investigators struggled to comprehend it. It was September 6, 2014, when authorities in Ridgeville, South Carolina, made a chilling discovery deep in the woods. There, hidden within several black garbage bags, were the lifeless bodies of 5 children. Their small, fragile bodies were in various stages of decomposition, discarded like trash, their short lives erased by the very person meant to protect them. Their killer, their father, Timothy Jones Jr., a man who was supposed to be their guardian, their protector, their safe place. Instead, he became their executioner. What could drive a father to strangle his own children with his bare hands? Was it mental illness, drug-fueled paranoia, or was he simply evil? But most of all, this is a story about 5 innocent lives stolen far too soon, and a justice system that had to decide whether mercy was even an option. Stay with us as we uncover one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Welcome to True Crime Revealed. If you enjoy deep dives into true crime, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an update. Brace yourself. This is the case of Timothy Jones Jr., the father who strangled his 5 children. To understand how a father could commit such an unspeakable crime, we need to go back to where it all began. A story of neglect, generational trauma, mental illness, and a descent into darkness. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. was born in 1981 into a world of instability and abandonment. His mother, Cindy Jones, left when he was just 18 months old. His father, Timothy Jones Sr., quickly remarried, but the household was far from stable. Jones Jr. was raised in an environment of neglect, bouncing between an abusive father, an uncaring stepmother, and a fractured family structure. By his teenage years, Jones was already showing signs of rebellion, getting into trouble, struggling with authority, and turning to crime. In 2001, at the age of 20, Jones Jr. was arrested for cocaine possession, check forgery, and car theft. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but was released after just 2. Upon his release, he attempted to rebuild his life, but the darkness inside him never truly left. After leaving prison, Jones met Amber Kaiser, a woman who would later become the mother of his 5 children. The two married in 2004, and over the next few years their family grew quickly. Jones Jr. seemed to have turned his life around, earning an engineering degree from Mississippi State University and securing a stable job. From the outside, it looked like a classic redemption story. But inside the home, a different reality was unfolding. Jones struggled with alcohol and drug use, particularly synthetic marijuana, which worsened his already fragile mental state. His paranoia grew worse, leading to controlling and abusive behaviors. His relationship with Amber began to crumble. He became obsessed with the idea that their youngest daughter, Abigail, was not biologically his. In 2013, Amber and Jones divorced. Despite his erratic behavior, Jones won full custody of their 5 children, a decision that would ultimately seal their fate. Amber never could have imagined that by giving up custody, she was unknowingly handing her children over to their killer. These were their names: Mara, 8 years old; the eldest sister, protective and responsible; Elias, 7 years old; the fun-loving, energetic older brother; Nathan, 6 years old; the child whose crime of touching an electrical outlet would trigger the horror; Gabriel, 2 years old, a toddler, barely able to speak, innocent and unaware of what was happening; Abigail, 1-year-old, just learning to walk, never knowing the world beyond her father's arms; a mother left heartbroken, thinking her children were in good hands; a father left unhinged, believing his own delusions. The warning signs were there, and on August 28, 2014, they would all come to a tragic conclusion. By August 2014, Timothy Jones Jr. was spiraling out of control. His paranoia was worsening. His drug use had increased. He was heavily using synthetic marijuana, also known as spice, a substance known to trigger delusions and violent behavior. He believed that his children were conspiring against him. No one knew it at the time, but the next few days would lead to one of the most horrifying crimes in modern history. August 28, 2014. A normal day turns deadly. It was supposed to be just another day. Jones picked up his 3 older children from school. He then collected his 2 youngest children from their babysitter. But by the next morning, he and the children had vanished without a trace. The first person to suspect something was wrong was the babysitter. August 29th, 2014. The first signs of trouble. 9:36 a.m. The babysitter calls Jones to arrange pickup. He doesn't answer. Growing concerned, she texts him, "Should I take the children to daycare?" Minutes later, Jones finally responds. He says they are going on a trip and assures her they will be back by Tuesday after Memorial Day. Something felt off. Later that day, she texts him again, "Don't forget to bring diapers when you drop off Gabriel and Abigail." Her message is left on read. By now, she knew something wasn't right. She wasn't the only one. August 30th, 2014. Desperate calls, no answers. Amber Kaiser, his ex-wife, began calling him repeatedly. Every call went straight to voicemail. Her voice in a recorded message was filled with desperation.
Tim, I'm not calling to argue or anything. I just, like, the past 2 or 3 phone calls, you've been, like, really on edge. I'm saying you're, like, coming off really frustrated or whatever. And I was just concerned about you, so please call. I'm not calling to argue or anything.
Jones never called back. At the same time, his grandmother, Roberta Thornsberry, was also calling him from Mississippi. She left multiple messages asking, "Where are you? Why aren't you responding?" No response. For 5 days, Timothy Jones Jr. and his 5 children were missing. And then, on September 1st, 2014, the babysitter received the most disturbing call yet. At 6:15 p.m., the babysitter's phone rang. It was Timothy Jones Jr. What he told her made her blood run cold. He claimed he was leaving South Carolina with the children to start a new life. He told her to clean his mobile home. He said she could take whatever she wanted from the house. The babysitter knew immediately this wasn't a vacation. He wasn't coming back, and that meant the children weren't either. She did the only thing she could do. She called law enforcement and Child Protective Services. Within hours, a nationwide alert was issued. Timothy Jones Jr. was officially a missing person. His 5 children were now classified as endangered. Days passed, no sign of Jones, no sign of the children, until September 6, 2014, when everything unraveled. A routine traffic stop in Smith County, Mississippi, would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in recent history. Deputies pulled over a Cadillac Escalade at a checkpoint. The driver was Timothy Jones Jr. Something was off about him immediately. He looked intoxicated and disoriented. There was a foul stench coming from his vehicle, a mix of decomposition and bleach. Officers noticed stains along the baseboards of his SUV. Then they ran his ID and license plate. What came back sent chills down their spines. His name had been flagged by the FBI's National Crime Information Center. He was supposed to be traveling with 5 children, but the children were nowhere to be seen. The officers asked him, "Where are your kids?" At first, Jones denied even having children, but when they pressed him further, he cracked. What he told them would become one of the most chilling confessions in American history. There was no turning back. Timothy Jones Jr. had crossed a line that could never be undone. 5 small, lifeless bodies lay in his home. The same children he had once rocked to sleep, dressed in the morning, and fed at the kitchen table. Now nothing more than objects he needed to dispose of. He didn't panic. He didn't cry. Instead, he got to work. A father had become a killer, and now he would become a cleaner. Jones moved through the house with eerie precision. He went to each of his children's beds and stripped the blankets, the same blankets that had once kept them warm. He laid their bodies onto the fabric, wrapping them like discarded belongings. Their arms, their legs, once filled with energy and life, were folded and forced into unnatural positions. Tight, neat, restrained. One by one, he dragged their wrapped bodies to the kitchen. Then the garbage bags came out. Thick, industrial, meant for trash, not for children. One by one, he shoved them inside. One by one, he tied the bags shut, sealing them away as if they had never existed. When he was done, 5 black plastic bags sat in a row on the floor. His children, his past, his biggest mistake. and now they had to disappear. Jones stepped outside and opened the trunk of his Cadillac Escalade. A vehicle once meant for family outings and school drop-offs, now transformed into a mobile coffin. He heaved the first bag into the back, gritting his teeth at the weight, then another, and another, until all 5 were stacked on top of each other, resting in the trunk like bags of old clothing headed for donation. But this was not a donation. This was a burial on wheels. To cover up the evidence, he threw clothes, blankets, and random trash over the bodies. If anyone looked inside, they wouldn't see children wrapped in plastic. They would see nothing out of the ordinary. Jones slammed the trunk shut, walked to the driver's seat, and slid inside. He gripped the steering wheel, stared ahead, and took a deep breath. Then, he turned the key. The engine roared to life. The murderer and his victims were on the move. For the next 9 days, Timothy Jones Jr. drove through 4 states, carrying the rotting bodies of his children just feet away from him. His route, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Each mile he drove, the stench of death grew stronger. Each stop he made, the bodies rotted further. And yet, he continued living as if nothing had happened. Day 1, leaving South Carolina, August 29, 2014. Before hitting the road, Jones cut off all contact with family and friends. His first stop? A gas station, where he bought synthetic marijuana, his drug of choice. He cranked up the music, drowning out the reality of what was in his back seat. Days 2 to 3, entering Georgia, August 30, 31, 2014. The bodies in the trunk began to bloat, gases from decomposition expanding the plastic bags. The hot southern summer accelerated the decay, turning the air inside his Escalade thick with the smell of rotting flesh. His solution? Buy air fresheners. Crack the windows. Act like nothing was wrong. But nothing could erase the reality behind him. Days 4 to 5. The rot takes over. September 2nd, 2014. By now, fluids from the bodies had begun seeping through the plastic, staining the carpet of the trunk. Jones continued driving, stopping only for gasoline, fast food, and more drugs. He interacted with clerks, cashiers, and strangers. None of them knew that just a few feet away, 5 small corpses were decomposing in his car. Days 6 to 7. Drowning in drugs. Drowning in madness. September 34th, 2014. Jones was now smoking synthetic marijuana constantly, slipping further into hallucinations and paranoia. He began talking to himself, scribbling disturbing notes in a journal. At one point, he considered burning the bodies right where he was, but hesitated. Days 8 to 9. The final decision, September 5th, 6, 2014. Jones arrived in Alabama, finally deciding on a remote area deep in the woods near Camden. He pulled onto an abandoned logging road, far from civilization. He stepped out, took one last look at his car, and opened the trunk. It was time to leave them behind. Jones didn't dig a grave. He didn't whisper their names. He didn't pray. Instead, he dragged each garbage bag from his trunk and tossed them onto the ground. One by one, he stacked the remains of his children like discarded garbage. Their once vibrant lives reduced to sealed plastic and rotting flesh. And then, he got back in his car and drove away. Without a second glance, without a hint of remorse. Timothy Jones Jr. had gotten rid of his burden, or so he thought. Later in Jones's personal notebook, police discovered a disturbing revelation. He had planned to burn the bodies. He wanted to grind their bones into dust. He thought he could erase all evidence that they had ever existed, but he never got the chance. Jones is brought into an interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. Detectives sit across from him, watching him closely. The room is silent. Then the first question. Where are your kids? At first, Jones lies. He says they're fine. He says they're back in South Carolina with family. He says this is all just a misunderstanding. The detectives say nothing. They just stare at him, letting the silence hang in the air. Jones starts shifting in his seat. Then they ask again, Tim, where are your children? His jaw tightens. His fingers tap against the table. His eyes dart to the camera in the corner of the room. And then he sighs. He looks down and he speaks. I followed suit with the other 4. The detectives lean in. What do you mean? Jones swallows. I killed them all. His voice is flat, emotionless, like he's reading a script, not confessing to the murder of his own children. And just like that, the case is solved. Now, it's just a matter of finding the bodies. After hours of questioning, Jones finally gives up the location. A team of law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and search dogs move it out at dawn. They travel down a narrow, isolated logging road in Camden, Alabama. The air is thick and humid, the forest silent, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Then, the smell hits them. A wave of rotting flesh and chemical decay. And then they see it. 5 black garbage bags, carelessly discarded among the trees. The officers pause. Some of them have seen horrific crime scenes before, but nothing like this. With gloved hands, they begin to open the bags. And what they find inside is beyond horror. Tiny, bloated bodies, twisted and crammed into the plastic. Skin peeling, darkened from days of heat and exposure. Limbs contorted unnaturally, as if they had been forced into positions they didn't belong. Some remains are barely distinguishable from the decomposition. The officers step back. Some turn away, their stomachs twisting. Others wipe their eyes, unable to comprehend the sheer cruelty of what they are seeing. The remains are carefully extracted, each body placed into separate evidence bags. The forensic team takes photos, measurements, and samples. It is grueling work, but it is necessary. These children deserve to be acknowledged, to be known, to be given justice. And now, with their bodies recovered, Timothy Jones Jr. will answer for his crimes. What happens next? With Jones finally caught, the battle for justice was just beginning. Would his defense argue insanity in an attempt to spare him from the death penalty? Would the jury see past the excuses and sentence him to the harshest punishment available? Would Amber Kaiser, the mother of the victims, plead for mercy for the man who took everything from her? The trial of Timothy Jones Jr. was about to begin, and justice was coming. The bodies had been found. The evidence was overwhelming. Timothy Jones Jr. had confessed to strangling his 5 children, stuffing them into garbage bags, and driving across multiple states with their decomposing remains in his SUV. Now the world would watch as he faced justice. But Jones wasn't going to go down without a fight. His defense team had one last strategy. They would argue that he was not a cold-blooded killer, but a mentally ill man who lost control. The courtroom was about to become a battleground. Would the jury see him as a man tormented by delusions, or would they see him for what he truly was, a murderer who knew exactly what he was doing? From the moment the trial began, the prosecution was relentless. They had one goal: to prove beyond any doubt that Timothy Jones Jr. was fully aware of his actions and that his crime was premeditated, deliberate, and inexcusable. They showed the jury crime scene photos, the black garbage bags, carelessly discarded in the woods, the twisted, decomposing bodies of the children inside. They played the haunting confession tape, where Jones described killing his kids in a voice that was eerily emotionless. They revealed his disturbing journal entries, where he had written plans to burn his children's bodies and erase all traces of their existence. They showed the jury receipts, evidence that Jones had gone shopping for synthetic marijuana while his children's corpses rotted in the back of his SUV. The prosecution's message was clear. This was not the act of a delusional madman. This was the act of a man who had a plan. They called it a crime of control. Jones had absolute power over his children, and the moment he thought they had turned on him, he chose to eliminate them. Their argument was airtight, but the defense wasn't done yet. Jones's defense attorneys knew they had no way to prove his innocence. So instead, they argued that Jones shouldn't be held fully responsible for his actions. Their claim? Jones wasn't an evil man. He was a deeply disturbed, mentally ill father who lost his grip on reality. They brought in psychologists and psychiatrists who testified that Jones had been using synthetic marijuana heavily, which can cause hallucinations and paranoia. He had a history of mental illness, possibly including schizoaffective disorder. He had suffered a head injury at 15, which may have damaged his ability to control impulses. His childhood was filled with trauma, abandonment by his mother, a neglectful father, and years of instability. They argued that, on the night of the murders, Jones was having a psychotic breakdown, that he wasn't thinking rationally, that he genuinely believed his children were trying to harm him, and that he should not be sentenced to death, but given life in a mental institution instead. The defense's case was heart-wrenching, but was it enough? Then came the hardest part of the trial, the testimonies of those left behind. First to take the stand was Amber Kaiser, the children's mother, the woman who had once trusted Timothy Jones Jr. to care for their kids. Now she was standing in front of the man who had slaughtered them. Her voice was strong but filled with pain as she spoke. She recounted the last time she spoke to her children, a phone call with Nathan before Jones abruptly hung up. She described the fear she felt when Jones stopped answering her calls. She broke down in tears when the prosecution showed her pictures of her children's remains, a sight no mother should ever have to endure. Her final words to the jury? "I pray for him all the time, but I can't bring myself to want anyone to die." Even after everything, Amber Kaiser could not wish death upon the father of her children. Her words hung in the courtroom, leaving the jury to wonder, did he deserve mercy, or did he deserve the ultimate punishment? After weeks of evidence, testimony, and gut-wrenching revelations, both sides made their final pleas to the jury. The prosecution, "Look at these photos. Look at what he did. This was not a crime of insanity. This was a crime of choice. He knew what he was doing. He covered it up. He tried to get away with it. Do not let him escape the consequences of his actions." The defense, "Timothy Jones Jr. is a broken man. He was not in control of his mind when he did this. He deserves to be locked away, but he does not deserve to die." The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell completely silent. Jones sat stone-faced, waiting for his fate. The judge spoke the words that sealed his destiny. "Timothy Ray Jones Jr., you are sentenced to death." No reaction. Jones sat completely still, as if the words meant nothing to him. His father and grandmother sat behind him, weeping silently. Amber Kaiser closed her eyes, breathing deeply. It was over. Justice had been served. Timothy Jones Jr. would spend the rest of his days on death row, waiting for the moment he would face the ultimate consequence of his crimes. But this case was far from over, because even after being sentenced to die, Jones would continue to fight for his life. Would Jones appeal his death sentence? Would the courts reconsider, given his claims of mental illness? And would the families of his victims ever find peace? The legal battle was not yet over. But for now, the world had delivered its judgment. Timothy Jones Jr. would never be free again. And now he would spend the rest of his days on death row, waiting for the moment he would face the ultimate consequence for his crimes. But Timothy Jones Jr. wasn't done fighting for his life just yet. Even after being sentenced, he continued to argue that he didn't deserve to die. The appeals process had begun. With the trial over, the public was divided. Some believed that death was the only fitting punishment for a man who had brutally murdered his 5 children. Others believed that his mental illness and drug use should have spared him from execution. The legal battle wasn't over. Now the fight moved to higher courts, where Jones would try to escape the fate he had been handed. In 2 years after being sentenced to death, Jones's legal team filed an appeal. Their argument? The prosecution had used graphic autopsy photos to shock the jury into voting for the death penalty. The jury's emotions had been manipulated, making it impossible for them to fairly judge his mental state. Jones's history of schizophrenia meant that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions. The defense requested a new trial, hoping that another jury might spare his life, but the state of South Carolina wasn't interested in leniency. In March 2023, the South Carolina Supreme Court reviewed Jones's case. After months of legal arguments, they reached a decision. While they acknowledged that autopsy photos were disturbing, they ruled that they were necessary to show the severity of the crime. They determined that Jones had been given a fair trial. They rejected the insanity plea, stating that his actions before, during, and after the murder showed clear intent. And finally, they upheld the death penalty. Jones had lost. He would remain on death row awaiting execution. While Timothy Jones Jr. sat in a prison cell, those who had once loved him were left to pick up the pieces. Amber Kaiser, a mother's endless grief. The woman who had once trusted him with her children was now living with an unthinkable loss. 5 children gone, their lives erased by the man she once loved. She had testified that she prayed for him, but she could never forgive him. There was no sentence that could bring back what she had lost. A legacy of pain. His father and grandmother had sat in the courtroom, listening to the horrific details of what he had done. They had raised him. They had watched him grow, and now they had watched him destroy everything. His grandmother sobbed when the death penalty was announced, whispering, "I don't want to lose him too." They had already lost 5 grandchildren. Now they were waiting for the courts to take their son away as well. Though he had been sentenced to death, Timothy Jones Jr. would likely spend years, if not decades, waiting for his execution. Death row inmates in South Carolina often wait 15-20 years before their sentence is carried out. He would continue appealing, filing motion after motion, trying to escape his fate. He would sit in a concrete cell, alone with his thoughts, just waiting. This case raises hard questions. Did Timothy Jones Jr. deserve the death penalty, or should he have been sentenced to life in prison? Should mental illness have been considered a bigger factor in his defense? And can justice ever truly be served when 5 young lives were lost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy true crime deep dives, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more shocking cases, turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, stay safe.